So I'm going to do like a very quick and dirty series of introductions, which is so not WashU, but here we go. You can read about all of these incredible people and their publications and their work. We have profiled them on our website. Find their books and their chapters and their articles. Find them on social media. They're wonderful. But for briefer introductions, for the purposes of time, Katina Rogers is an independent scholar, editor, and educational consultant, working with institutions to design and implement structures that are creative, sustainable, and equitable. Rupika Risam is associate professor of film and media studies and of comparative literature at Dartmouth College. Katja Perat is a Slovenian novelist, essayist, and poet, and an assistant professor of writing at University of Alaska Anchorage, and a WashU alum, woohoo. Ashley Chiami McNeil is a public scholar and currently the director of education and research at Full Spectrum Features, which is an arts and media nonprofit. Michelle Daniel Jones is arriving in a couple of moments. She's a 6-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University and a founding member and board president of Constructing Our Future, a reentry and housing organization for women created by incarcerated women in Indiana. And Maggie Nettesheim Hoffmann is the Associate Director of Career Diversity for the Humanities Without Walls consortium, which is headquartered at UIUC, and she is a graduate student at Marquette University. Right on. So, and one more way of describing you all, raise your hand if these statements apply to you, okay? So raise your hand if you have a PhD. Raise your hand if you're a PhD student. Raise your hand if you've taught college courses. Keep your hand up if you're currently teaching in college, okay? Raise your hand if you do research. Raise your hand if you do not any longer work in a university at all. Cool. Raise your hand if you've published peer-reviewed articles, chapters in a book, or a whole book. Raise your hand if you've exhibited visual art or produced dramatic works. Sweet. Visual art or produced dramatic works. Yeah. This also applies to Michelle. That was for her too, so she's raising her hand. And raise your hand if you write novels or poems. All right, great, excellent. So I'm gonna get kicked off with a few questions. The first question, sorry. Before we start, there's a microphone. If you could hit the little button and it should turn green. And if we can try to speak into the microphone so that we can record, that would be fabulous. Maggie, I'm gonna start with you, but all of these questions are for everyone. So when Maggie is, just for organizational purposes, I'll start with Maggie and then everyone can kick in. I'd love to hear from everybody. So the first question is, humanities programs and organizations often struggle to convey the impact of their work to outside audiences. So what are some simple ways that students can start to think about their work in terms of measuring its impact? How can we reframe what we do in our daily work as crucial? How can we, in our everyday actions in the university, start to shift the unhelpful and inaccurate notions about humanists as ineffective and disconnected academic workers? We'll just get right into it.
So, can you all hear me? Is that good for recording purposes too? First of all, before I get to the question, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Meredith and to Laura and to Alicia and the entire team here at Washington University for putting together this amazing couple of days of workshop sessions. And I'm really, really honored to be counted amongst this group of amazing scholars and women and administrators and experts and thinking through these big questions, and especially helping to support and design student-centered programming especially for graduate students. So this has become kind of I never anticipated it when I entered my PhD program, but this has really become a part of my identity in a lot of meaningful ways, so thank you very much. I took 2 pages of notes when I knew that this question was going to be asked, and so I kind of split it apart. So bear with me as I kind of go through this a little bit, but first, in thinking through this question of what are some simple ways that students can start to think about your work as students in terms of measuring impact, I think first and simply, one place you can start is by building a personal reflection practice. Come to know yourself, and I'm sure you know yourself in a lot of different ways, but really start at that foundation. Why is it that you started a journey towards earning a PhD? And this is at the core of what we do when we meet with our fellows through the Humanities Without Walls Fellowship Workshop each year. And there are now over 230 PhD students in the humanities who have participated in those HWW workshops with us. I think a reflection practice, and we have feedback from our students who've participated in this with us, it empowers them to take agency and control over their lives while they're working on their degrees, and to say, and to kind of reject older notions or older definitions or one kind of narrow definition of what it means to succeed in the academy. Additionally, at Marquette, which if you don't know is a Jesuit institution, and I can't escape that context myself, we call this practice discernment. And it has a 500-year tradition. In some spaces you might hear it referred to as design your life. And so I often like to say, hey, the Jesuits have been doing this for 500 years. And you can do this in a way that removes the spiritual or the religiosity, that kind of context from it in the way that the Jesuits do it. But I think it's an important practice to help the individual learn a little bit more about yourself and your place in the world and how you identify or define that for yourself. Additionally, I would suggest through that reflection practice, come to know and understand your multi-hyphenated identities. So at HWW, we say it's, for me at least, and this is something that I have learned as I've helped facilitate these types of workshops. I'm a scholar, I'm an educator, I'm a historian, and not very sexy, I think I'm an administrator. And I think I'm really good at being an administrator. Some of my friends and colleagues are great activists. And I think that there's a place for the administrator to help alongside the activist. And so I often like to think of it as I'm someone who likes to connect ideas to opportunity. And I think that that for me is what I find really meaningful. And then secondly, as I was drinking my morning cup of coffee this morning, knowing I was going to get this question, my colleague Ben Lindsay, who's our program coordinator for Humanities Without Walls, is in the back. And we were talking about this today. And Ben reminded me of one of our core principles at HWW, which is collaboration. So I think about how your work can be collaborative in nature. Right? I'm a historian, so often we go into our archives and we're doing that archival work by ourselves. But at HWW, we take seriously the idea that humanists need to work with others reciprocally and in community with them. Not in the old model of a one-directional kind of university outwards into the community, but by enabling our community partners to participate on their own terms in research projects with us, to help us co-design and co-create projects, and also to be equitably resourced for their time and contributions within our projects. So I think that those simple projects, right, reflection practice, thinking about collaboration is one way to start. Simply thinking about how we can measure our impact. And then additionally, to the second question, how can we reframe what we do in our daily work as crucial? One of the exercises that we lead at HWW on the first day of the workshop is something that we call speed dating. How do you define what your work even is? But then once you've defined that, how do you then articulate its value to contexts or audiences outside of the academy or outside of someone who might be in your discipline? So what we do, we have 30 PhD students who join us every year, and we set up 2 rows, and students sit across from each other. And we ask them, okay, the person sitting across from you, they're a fellow scholar. Explain in 1 minute what your work is. And then they switch. And then they talk about in the next 3 minutes what they learned from each other. Then we ask one row to get up, switch partners, move down, and we change the question. We ask them, imagine that the person sitting in front of you is a university administrator who can give you a travel grant for your research. You have 1 minute to make that pitch. Then they switch and they reflect on it again. And then they get up again, they switch partners, and the final third question we ask them, the person sitting in front of you is a program officer from a foundation and they can give you $1 million to fund your research. You have 1 minute to make your pitch to that person. And so then they do the exercise again, and every year we see students share with us, oh my gosh, understanding that the context changes with the audience and how they have to really articulate that and their value in different ways. They wouldn't have started to think about that without actually doing the exercise. So I think it's practice. Practice how you communicate your value to the world and to the public. And don't hesitate to do that. And then finally, the last thing, because I don't want to take up too much time, how can we in our everyday actions in the university start to shift the unhelpful and inaccurate notions about humanists as ineffective and disconnected academic workers? I would say start by reflecting on our own actions. What are the spaces in which we hold onto some of these cultural norms in the academy, which might suggest that different notions of what success means could be seen as a failure? Oftentimes, our fellows from HWW will confess to us during the workshop, I can't tell other people at my university that I've applied for this fellowship experience because I might be cut off from funding. So I want us to interrogate. I don't think it's as bad. I think that culture is changing, but those are certainly, there are students who are afraid to even admit that they're thinking about participating in workshops like HWWs. And I would also say my own department at in the history department at Marquette, initially about 6 years ago, didn't support my advocacy efforts and actually cut me off from funding after I started to get into this. After I started to get into this world. So I would say we need to start with ourselves and examine what it is or how we ourselves might keep some of those old cultural norms perpetuated. So support innovation, support reform, and try to advocate for grad student support programming as best as you're able in whatever space you might find yourself. So I think that, yeah.
Yeah, could I actually? Please. So there's something else that I've been thinking about. I really appreciated everything you had to say about thinking about impact in particular. Something that's been on my mind related to this recently is that the way that the question about impact and the usefulness of the humanities is often framed tends to put people on a back foot and makes us start from a defensive position. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about the fact that where that rhetoric often comes from, it's often from like a conservative political move that's also aimed at defunding and dismantling humanities programs. The parallel of that I see happening at the same time is the voice of book banning, the voice of censorship, the voice that tries to tamp down humanistic discourse because it feels powerful and potentially dangerous. And I don't think that those two things can be true at the same time. We can't be both irrelevant and dangerous and powerful simultaneously. And so I think that question of irrelevance is really, it draws us away from the potential power that we could step into and own with the work that we're doing, and that is a power that can create a sense of fear and risk from folks who maybe don't stand to gain from a change in power structures. So I think, also taking that question with a grain of salt as not always being a question that's coming from a place of genuine curiosity is something to keep in mind as well.
I was actually thinking along some of those same lines. Even if you think about the kind of work that we do within the university structure in and of itself, it seems that there exists such a thing as a pre-existing hierarchy of knowledge in which quantitative methods will always come before qualitative methods. And it seems like particularly if we're thinking about what can we do to encourage graduate students to, I guess, just claim their space in the world as humanists, which seems to be gravely important, I think has to bear some sort of an effective component or some sort of a component that has to address the issues of pride, courage, the ability to take agency, to claim your position as something that I guess has a right to exist and doesn't always need to come from a place where you're always already apologizing for doing the kind of work that you're doing. So maybe thinking about trying to do some community building work that would allow for that to happen without thinking about, how this applies to the job market or not, I think would do tremendous work just to empower people.
I'll speak quickly to this idea, I don't know which one to lean into here, to this idea of measuring impact, because it's definitely something that I'm figuring out and probably will always be figuring out in my role. So I work at a social justice nonprofit that very much is in the film and arts and media world. We're based out of Chicago. And so measuring impact is a very real thing. We get a lot of, I would say most of our funding is soft money through foundations and through grant monies. And so you know, it's, Maggie, I love how you were, you know, starting with the self, right, and like that reflective piece, and then the bridge into making that legible, right, to other people with other metrics is like the crunchy bit for me, right?
Yeah.
And it's a fun problem to try to solve because it's different every time. But one thing that I'll say in as somebody who is still figuring it out is that sometimes the most powerful arguments for the kind of impact that we do at my organization, which is very arts and humanities based, comes from other people. And so going into, you know, another piece of what it means to build community is also people who can testify to your impact. Yes, you have to argue it, but it's just the awareness of how we show up for one another in that way. Because I testify, I you know, and it, like, write letters of support, but that goes so much deeper, you know, than just like a grant partnership. So that's one thing that I'm like just constantly kind of mulling over these days.
I would just want to add that I think there's multiple ways of conceptualizing impact, and in higher ed, it's often sort of talked about as things like citations and grant money and lines on your CV. If we actually take a step back and think, what are we making an impact on? We can make an impact on a discipline. We can make an impact on our cohort. We can make an impact on community partners that we're working with. We can make an impact on public discourse. And so it actually is almost taking a step back and saying, where are the places that I actually can, what can I have an impact on? To be able to really conceptualize all these facets of your identity and your agency that have been articulated so nicely by everybody else.
Hi, Michelle. Hi. It's good to see you. Good to see you. Do you want to add anything to this question? Or should we move to the next? No. Yeah. No. Okay. We'll move to the next question. I'll start with Katina. So grant writing, since we brought that up already. Grant writing is one of the most obvious change-making activities that humanities scholars can take part in. So I would love to hear a little bit from everybody. And I know I asked like 3 questions at once when I really should just be asking one, so you don't have to, you know. But when did you write your first grant and what led you to it? And how, any advice for graduate students today to sort of approach that work as part of their doctoral experience?
Yeah, I love this question because nobody ever asks me this question, actually. And I think it's such an important piece. So I came into grant writing backwards. As a grad student, I did not touch any grant writing experiences. I didn't know anything about grants. I didn't know anything about foundations. It was still very much a part of the invisible system that helped academia do what it was doing, but was not legible to me at all. But while I was still working on my PhD, I moved to New York. My graduate work was at the University of Colorado. I moved to New York for personal reasons. My partner got a job out there and needed to find a job. And so I registered with a temp agency that specialized, their clients were mainly nonprofits and foundations in the city. And so this was, I liked the fact that it gave me a chance to connect with organizations that were mission driven, that I hadn't had experience working in previously and really didn't have exposure to when I was living in Colorado. And so I had various short-term placements in these grant-making organizations. One of them eventually unfolded into a full-time position at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which is a science and technology funder. And that was where I started to understand really what grant-making looks like, both in terms of its mechanics and in terms of its strategy. And for me, it was so interesting to come to it from that direction because it was demystified from the beginning for me. The first time I saw it was from the other side. It was program officers reading and assessing people's initial inquiries. It was people talking with one another about these proposals the way they might talk about a dissertation. It felt like a dissertation defense every time almost, with these program officers in a room together discussing the merits of this possibility of who they wanted to support and why and what they thought the potential was. And I found it so intellectually interesting to see what that work actually looked like. And it also, I mean, I feel so lucky to have gotten a chance to see what successful grant proposals looked like from the beginning. Because when do you get to see that stuff? It's all so opaque, you know? You don't, this is not something that we commonly share with each other. And so my first exposure to grants was seeing other people's stuff. It was seeing, what does it look like to write a compelling story about the work that you want to do? What is it that makes someone say, you know, this has promise, but we just can't take this risk right now? What is it that causes, you know, somebody to not give it a second look? All of that was very much exposed in ways that I don't think it ever really is when you're the one writing it. And the stakes are high, and you have nothing else to sort of measure your work against. From there, I sort of crept into writing grants myself little by little. First, I was in a grant-funded position, and so I had a chance to see, you know, what did the proposal look like that paid for my salary? And how are we going to write a report to say it was a good decision to hire me? From there, I was in a role at the Modern Language Association where we had a grant that was already running, and so again, it was sort of figuring out what the reporting looked like, what the budget looked like, figuring out how to plug into that and move it forward, but then also how to write some new projects that would advance the work that we were trying to do. All of that for me was very supervised. And then eventually when I was working at City University of New York at CUNY, that was where I sort of migrated into, or really grew into, conceptualizing and writing something on my own, both successfully and unsuccessfully. Like, I have written a lot of grant proposals that did not get anywhere, as I think we all probably have. But for me, having that kind of scaffolded approach meant that there wasn't ever a moment where I felt like, oh, I'm writing a grant for the first time. It felt like it grew slowly over time, and it wasn't a mystery by the time I got there and was writing a $3.5 million grant. So for students, I would say don't do what I did and have zero exposure to this while you're in a university context where these grants are circulating around you, but often invisibly. Actually, just out of curiosity, how many of the folks here are graduate students? Okay, great. And how many of you are going to be here for the workshops tomorrow? Also great. Okay, thank you. Just wanted some context. Yeah, so the best thing that you can do is start asking people around you, like ask your advisor if there are any grants that they're working on. Try to listen in on the kinds of projects that people are thinking about, that they would love to advance, that they're trying to figure out a way to move forward, that they're complaining about because it's a ton of work and a short deadline and it's like complicated to pull all the pieces together. And see if you can read the work that they're putting together. If it's possible, and if you have the bandwidth, and if it's appropriate in the context of what the project is. When I was at CUNY, I loved being able to bring grad students in on the writing process in kind of distinct and discrete ways so that it didn't feel too big, but gave students a chance to have their hands in it a little bit. I think this is really important for budgets too, because budgets, especially coming out of the humanities, can be one piece that feel very opaque, and they don't have to be that scary. They're a really important part of the strategy in how you build a program, and having a sense of confidence and fluency in how to read and build a budget will take you very far, because a lot of people don't have it. So building up those skills over time before the stakes are high would be my biggest suggestion. And then just to close, I just want to echo what was in the question, which is that this is a really significant area of impact. I have the chance right now to be working with Ashley and Full Spectrum Features in a grant writing project right now, and I think grant writing is often undervalued as an intellectual exercise. There's so much thoughtful writing that goes into writing a grant. It really forces you to think about questions of audience and purpose in meaningful ways. And sometimes it gives you a chance to see if there's something there or not. There was a project that I worked on in a different context that we got to a certain point and just felt like there was no there, you know, and so we let it go. And it was valuable to have gone through that exercise. So I think seeing it as intellectual, seeing it as strategic, seeing it not as, you know, like a chore that needs to be done, but something that can be an act of advocacy, that can be an act of resistance in some cases, It's also a great way to use like oil barons' money for good. So if you can get it, I recommend it. So thanks for the question. And yeah, if others want to chime in.
Yeah, just really quick, I'd like to, to add to that, in a very practical way, is that I kept a master document on the project. If it was on my research or if it was a grant for my nonprofit, I keep a master document that has all of the particulars in one place on that project. The SWOT analysis on it, the strengths and weaknesses of the project, the narrative about the impact, the narrative about how we're going to measure. I mean, all of those things, that kind of organization, top to bottom, is good to have. And then a master timeline, because I don't know if any of you are like me. In the beginning, when I was applying for grants, I would just note the deadline, not the prep for the grant that was required, and then would be freaking out in the last hours trying to hammer in a grant, right? So if you know your writing style, mine is a long form. I have a tendency to overwrite. For those folks who know their writing style, then build in those that extra time. Change your due date on your calendar to be more reflective of the way in which you write and the way in which you edit. It is an art in a lot of ways, and I appreciate what you said about, before it's high stakes, because you're applying to grad school is a type of some of that language about how you are selling yourself, your interests, your research interests, your field, where you want to land and grow, what faculty is at that university that you're excited to work with, what other students are doing this. All of that is the same type of narrative writing that is like key to writing grants. It's just that same skill that you use to do your personal statement, to do your career statement to get into grad school. It's similar. It's similar work. And just be like really organized. I mean, if you're not an organized person, nothing like a grad program to make you get organized. So that's what I would say.
So I have actually almost the opposite story of Katina's, because I went to Emory for my PhD, and Emory at that time, a really well-developed teach graduate students how to write grants situation. And so there was like first year luncheon and second year whatever, and then at some point there was a whole class, and it was the only useful class I took in graduate school. But it was specifically for humanists, and I think there were a lot of challenges for us, because we would sit there and say, but what are we going to use money for? And it's true, because you're like, well, I just need to go read books and have thoughts and write things. But so you can ask for money to pay yourself to do that. And so the other piece that was really challenging in that class that we all struggled with was a methodology. And we would have people in the class saying, we're humanists, we don't have methodologies. And then we all glommed onto this. Well, I'm going to do some close reading and triangulate. Everybody triangulated. It took me many years to stop triangulating. Triangulating these theories in order to do whatever we were claiming we were going to do. But it was very hard. And also our professors were people who sat on NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities panels, who would tell us what would happen in these panels and tell us exactly what panelists would say about our proposal drafts. And it was not very nice. But it was an absolutely incredible experience to really spend time about thinking about how do you talk about what you do? How do you explain that thing that is driving you and inspiring you and making you cry, making you joyful, to someone who has A, absolutely no idea what you do, and B, probably doesn't care as much as you do about it. And so tying into what Michelle was saying, it's not just about the grant. It's not just about even the grad school application. If you have a really good handle on what you're doing, you're in a good position to write a fellowship application. You're in a good position to write a job letter, because that ability to really hone your ideas is really, really valuable. So my recommendation, and I did this, is try to see what internal grants are available here. And maybe it's like, for at Emory, it was like, $2,000 to like participate in something and go to an archive or something, right? And just apply for those things because it's a really good practice to articulate your ideas. And so then when I left Emory, I went to Salem State University where I worked for 9 years until 2022. And I started by applying for internal grants, and we used internal grants to build some programs on our campus. And then eventually I said, we should apply for an NEH, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And so then we applied for that. We got that. And then we got one of those sort of moments where somebody from the Mellon Foundation comes to you and says, if you had a blank check for your research, what would you do with it? And I said, I would give it to other people. And they said, that's not what we do. And I said, well, that's what I would like you to do. So essentially, I run a $3 million Mellon money laundering operation at the moment, in which they trusted my university to take $3 million and give it to other regional public universities that they did not think could handle the money on their own. So now, even though I don't work there anymore, I still do lots of paperwork because I didn't write in somebody into the grant to actually do that paperwork for money, which is also my tip on things you can spend money on that you don't necessarily know about. But it's really like getting started small, getting that practice of sharing your ideas. And then if you have other things you want to do, apply for it. But here's the other thing. Not everything needs a grant. I mean, if you literally are saying all I really need to do is to sit down for 3 hours and pan something out, you don't need to apply for a grant, because the good thing about getting a grant is getting a grant. And the bad thing about getting a grant is getting a grant, because it's a lot of work.
So here's my story with grant writing. I think that writing for travel grants or writing for research grants or writing for a fellowship, that is a kind of form of writing that'll prepare you for larger, maybe a Mellon grant, foundation grant. So I had done that before HWW came along. And then in 2018, I was invited to work with Humanities Without Walls. And by early 2020, I was starting to work and help write a project for a $5 million 5-year grant project while I was a PhD student. And now, so yeah, it was. But what I have learned as a part of that, I always try to say to my speakers at HWW, don't use the word luck, because luck is really just preparation meeting opportunity. But I think in this way, I was very fortunate in that I was able to work with a team from the University of Illinois who really helped uplift me and the work that I do at Marquette University. But here's the thing that I would also say, to Rapika's point. There is the pre-award stage of grant writing, and then there's the post-award stage of grant writing. And knowing who your team is going to be, thinking through the questions of budget, really understanding how a grant budget works and operates, knowing the people at your university, whether it's called, at Marquette, it's called the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. Who is your research and sponsored programs team? Getting to know them, because those are the administrators who know how to navigate the bureaucracy that is required to administer and to manage a grant. And that is a whole other learning curve that graduate students don't learn while we're working on our degrees or on our research. And we can have long conversations about that. But that also comes to think about then, how do you measure impact? And if you're not thinking about the assessment of your grant work while you're writing your grant, then I think you're not doing justice to the grant project in and of itself. Because it might be that you find out, as Katina mentioned, maybe your grant isn't the right fit for the funder to whom you're applying, and you need to pivot in terms of where you're thinking of finding funding. So that's a whole other part of that writing process, thinking about what happens in that post-award stage, because I have been on a learning curve over the last 4 years with that.
Can I jump back in really quickly? And I just also want to say that depending on if you pursue a career in academia as a professor and you end up at a community college, you end up at a regional comprehensive university, perhaps even a small liberal arts college, there is tremendous inequality and variation in the kind of support that you will have for grants. At Salem State, it was one person, and they basically push the button. And that's it. And I had to do everything by myself. At Dartmouth, obviously, it's very different. They have a very, very well-oiled machine of grant things that I get in trouble with all the time because I'm so used to having done all these things myself. Why would I talk to you? And so just know that that's a huge thing. And, you know, when you sit on panels for grants, it's really, really disheartening when you're trying to argue for what's happening at that regional comprehensive because it's important and it's exciting, and you're up against, you know, WashU, right? Yeah. And WashU and its professional machine of grant writing where the rich get richer. Right. So just know that take advantage of being here and take advantage of everything you can learn, because one day you could be me going somewhere for 9 years where you have absolutely no support except for somebody who pushed the button on the government's website.
Yeah. It's true at R2s as well. So at Marquette, in our Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, we have one staff member who manages the post-award stage of 600 grants at the university. So it's even at R2s, right? There is a real distinction in hierarchy between what it's like to be at a really well-resourced R1 versus at an R2.
We could have a whole roundtable on grants. I want to pivot a little bit to some other questions. I'm going to start with you, Ashley. And Ashley would have a lot of things to say about grants too. So hit up Ashley on email.
Anytime.
Yeah.
But from like the non-academic side.
True.
Like
Yeah, absolutely. So many of you have highly varied CVs that detail a lot of unexpected ways to use your humanistic skills. So tell me a little tidbit. What is one of the most interesting or generative side gigs you've had before, during, or after graduate school? And what did that experience produce for you?
Yeah. I'm going to sneak this over here. It's side gigs are it's an interesting thing in that like so many of my connective pieces into like the work that I do today is so present. But in order to just focus on one, so I actually flew in this morning from Sacramento. I live in Denver. My organization is based in Chicago, but I flew in from Sacramento this morning, and I flew in from the California State Child Welfare Conference. And I was there because one of my side gigs is, and also I work at a social justice nonprofit, so everybody has a side gig. Like that's a thing. But so I kind of had the good fortune, I guess, of meeting some people through some facilitation events and trainings that I did, who connected me with this group of child welfare lawyers who are mostly based in Denver, and they were forming this collective, I guess, to help states work kind of from the ground up with diverse community members, so stakeholders who have some sort of relationship with the child welfare system, right? Whether that is as a resource parent, as a caseworker, as a judge, as a probation officer, as a former foster youth, et cetera, okay? And we work with that kind of groundswell of different community members to systems map what their local region and local area, usually a cluster of about 10 counties, what the train looks like for them in child welfare spaces. And then we start working with them to think through possible solutions, positive deviances to that complexity mapping. And then we help them kind of issue a set of imperatives, if you will, back to the state. So every state has to prepare what they call PIPs or process improvement plans to the federal government. And every state relies on federal monies in order to run their child welfare system. It is a wildly different world than what I do in my day job, as I like to call it. At Full Spectrum Features, we're very much in like the film production world and the storytelling world and education and working, along new mandates of what is being required in schools. And that's part of the joy, I think, of what I get to do in this side gig. And it really is humanistic in the sense that I work so closely with communities that 5 years ago I wouldn't have ever really imagined working with these communities. in these parts of California. So it's a lot of fun, and also it's a very like windy and perplexing road of how you get into some of these other spaces and other roles. But I will say it also kind of blossoms, right? And it gives you these opportunities, to bring it back around to this idea of connective tissues, of how it kind of all folds back and informs, the other hats that I wear. But from working with California, I'm also starting to work with the state of Montana around a community of practice around ICWA. And it's a really unique group of fascinating, really heartful people. And through that, I also get to hear about the stories that they want to tell, right, for their communities and the tribes in Montana. And that has swung back around into my storytelling work at Full Spectrum Features, right? And so it's one of those things where you can't ever expect it or try to force that shoe to fit, but rather to be open to maybe some of those wild possibilities is one of the perks of kind of needing a side gig, especially when you work in a nonprofit world. But it's also, to be frank, a lot, and to be balancing, truly kind of the grunt work of it, the travel, the hours, it's there's a cost there, but it's also a lot of fun, and it stimulates the intellectual side of the work that I do in a really fun way that helps me, I think, be a better facilitator of community when it comes back into the storytelling realm and education. So I'll leave it there.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think that was really wonderful. I'm not an American, so I have a non-American anti-work argument. I think that was really wonderful, and I think one of the important things to think about on the margins of that, as we're thinking about how to compile a CV, is that we're, particularly as academics, and particularly if you're trying to apply for an academic job, kind of encouraged to hide the eclecticism that is sort of inherent to being human in the world. And I think trying to, of course, be mindful of your specific rhetorical situations. Don't necessarily play with that when you're applying for your job. But I do think that, sort of employing, just a practice of the mind that will help you try to understand while you're doing these things that may seem fairly different on the page, how they actually bleed into one another, I think is extremely important. And does actually become a pretty important employment skill too. But I'm not here to say that. What I wanted to say, is that we should all be able to make a living from having one job. And if that's not a case for us, we should fight for it to become. But that I also feel that the most important aspects of how I am or how I do my work come from things that aren't work related. Yeah. And that trying to cultivate the space and the time to do things that are completely non-profitable, like doing music or just being out, speaking as an Alaskan, is a really important skill that you also need to learn, especially if you're continuously encouraged to organize the entirety of your life around labor.
Yeah, it changes your brain. Being a parent changes the way that I think. I've gotten really obsessed with ecology and mycology, and going out and looking for mushrooms changes the way that I think. I love it. And I think one of the things that's been, so my whole job is side gigs now, so I'm not going to say too much because I could talk about it for a long time, but it's been really surprising and gratifying for me to see that, like Ashley was saying, that things blossom over time. I think I had a tendency to forget that something that I did at one point in time would always be something that I did, that I could still draw on that 2 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later. It's actually still my thought or my thing that I did, my thing that I cared about in the world. It's not gone just because I didn't do something productive with it immediately. And to be able to cycle back to those things, it has been really rewarding. All of this is also relationship work, whether we're talking about grant writing or the kinds of opportunities that unfold in the professional spheres that we're in. It all unfolds because of the relationships that we build over time, which we don't build in a transactional way. That's not what makes them feel organic and whole and sustaining.
I just would like to add really quick, I really appreciate this conversation so much. I think for me, coming from my background of incarceration, I think about when I was applying to grad school, I had to creatively shape my carceral experience and the academic work that I did inside to be legible to people who were reviewing these applications. So I've always been trying to, for a while, get to this place where my stuff, is it enough? Is it enough? So let me throw everything in here. I've kind of crossed a bit in a different level of consciousness now that I leave it all in there. And I have an obscenely long CV. It's just what it is. I'm owning it because I'm on the other side of that my experiences, my collective experiences are valuable, not just to you, the potential employer or the potential grantor, but to me. And so by the proliferation of all this, I'm showing you that I am living in my full enoughness now. And so you're gonna see the subject matter expertise. You're gonna see where they've put me on selection committees to choose folks for fellowships. You're gonna see these extra side gigs, the art, my artistry and writings and all these things, because I want you to understand that I have a carceral history, but I am much more than the individual label of someone who's been impacted by the criminal legal system, a felon, offender, inmate, what have you. So I'm going to give you my full self to let you get to where I am if you are tripping on that. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. I am realizing that I've been doing a terrible, immoderate job of moderating. And so I'm going to move to our next question. And I want to start with Roopsie. So we usually hear this question framed as like a productivity problem, as a series of solutions for writer's block for your dissertation. But I'm more interested in and curious about how hobbies and activities can be the central and life-giving passions around which we build our scholarly and writing lives. So what brings you into connection with the world beyond campus, and what keeps you coming back to your desk in a thriving way?
So it made me so happy that I got this question, because 2 years ago, I would have been shrinking into myself, hoping nobody tried to make me answer it. When I was at a conference in 2018, I was sitting next to somebody who's now a very good friend at dinner, and she's trying to get to know me. And she says, so what are your hobbies? And I just looked at her like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I go antiquing. And I'm like, how nice for you. And I was like, I cooked dinner? Because I had nothing else in my life except work. And on some level, even though I think I wasn't admitting it to myself, I had fallen into the trap of I am so busy and I have so much to do and I cannot stop. And if I stop, then all the balls I am trying to keep in the air are going to all fall down to the ground. And it was very much a sort of symptom of working in that neoliberal system of academia and a system of publisher parish. And the irony is I didn't have to. I didn't go to Salem State thinking I'm going to publish my way out of here. I went there thinking like, this sounds like a really cool place where I can do all these things that I want to do, that nobody's going to get on my case about what is this digital humanities thing you do. And they didn't. It was great. But sort of over time, as a research career came to me without really my seeking it out, there just wasn't enough time when I had a 4-4 teaching load, and then they also decided I should be department chair, which, by the way, apparently today, I was decided to, that I was going to be department chair again at my new institution after being there for about 18 months. So apparently I'm new here, I don't know anything act did not go very well. Anyway, to answer your question, though, is that I, by complete sheer accident, became an equestrian last summer.
Yay!
And I went to ride a horse to amuse a friend. I had never been near a horse. I'd never been to a stable. I didn't know anything about horses. And my friend was sad because her kid went to sleepaway camp. And she said, we're going to go ride a horse. And I said, okay. So I rode this horse. And I thought, wow, well, this is fun. Where has this thing been my whole life? Now, let me give you some context. This is like the hippiest barn on earth. Like, it's like the land of broken people who are all like trying to recover from basically having been me, or some version of me. And, and the horses don't wear shoes. And it's like $30 to ride a horse. So for an hour. So it was a lesson. So it's great. I mean, this is like not like bougie horseback riding, like 100 upper shit. So I have a community of people, a barn family that has absolutely nothing to do with anything I do most of the time and doesn't care about what I do and has no expectations of me being good at anything. And but the greatest day, I was on a ride with a bunch of people, and the barn owner heard me say something about a book. And she said, oh, well, what's your book about? And this is the Digital Black Atlantic, which is an edited collection about Black diaspora digital humanities. And I said, it's about how Black communities have used technology to tell their stories. And she was like, oh my gosh, that sounds so interesting. And it was the greatest moment of my academic career. That I made someone who like could not give a shit about academia care about an academic book. It was the greatest thing ever. It changed my life. So I highly recommend. You could just go for a walk. Leave your house. Because I didn't. Also, pandemic didn't do that for 2 years. Anyway, so yes, hobbies, very important.
Anyone else have any hobbies that they want to share? Yeah, go ahead, Maggie.
I kind of feel this question viscerally because I had a moment during the pandemic, or at least when we were kind of starting to come out of the pandemic, where I too was like, I don't think I have any hobbies. What does that say about me? Like I'm doing too much. And so for me, the thing that I've really picked up, at least with some colleagues at work, which again, maybe I should separate this from my workspace, but we've built a little kind of community of practice where we go and we do yoga with one another 1 day a week. So a former employee who used to work in the graduate school at Marquette earned her yoga teacher certification during the pandemic, and as a part of her licensing, she needed to provide a karma project, which was, 4 classes for free to a community of people who otherwise didn't have access to yoga. And I thought, well, could we host this, at the grad school? And she said, yeah. So we started this last year, and I have, it's carried on. And so we pay her a little bit of money, and we host it right in the basement of our where our offices are located. And we kind of call it embedded wellness because it's so convenient for everybody to just come down there at 4:30 on every Tuesday night. And it's built a little bit of community for my colleagues who work with me in the graduate school at Marquette. And I've realized, I really like this practice, and it makes me feel good and strong. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question of what are my hobbies, because I certainly want to be known more than just, or at least inside myself, than just the work that I do.
Well, I do a lot of things. I think there's no need to get into any of that, although I did just become very obsessed with skate skiing. Again, Alaska things. But I just want to say that I don't work more than not work, and that I feel that that's become like a difficult thing to say, and I want to normalize it. Like I work so that I can do other things. Arguably, a lot of those things would still have something to do with writing or making art in one way or another, but I find it really important that they're not structured as work because it makes it possible for me to have an authentic relationship with them.
Sorry, I'll be quick. Something I've realized about myself too is that I really love the moment of going from knowing nothing to knowing a little bit about something, and I find it so freeing to be completely new at something when so much of being an academic is about your expertise getting deeper and deeper and deeper. I find it very liberating to do something that I know nothing about.
Can I just add one thing really quickly, which is to say you may be saying, how do these people have time for hobbies? Because you may feel like you have so many things to do or so many things you could be doing that you don't have time for it. I've actually found that by taking the time to not work, it actually makes my working time more meaningful and useful for me, because a lot of it was spent scrolling on Twitter not wanting to write. And now instead I sort of sit down and I write. So it's really weird. It's like counterintuitive, but it's true.
Speaking of grad school, it's long, and some of us come out of it totally irreverent about things that we went in really like knowing that we needed to learn, like citation norms and notions of academic rigor and respectability politics within the department. So quickly, if we could, we'll start with God. The irreverence. We'll go to God. What did you become irreverent about in graduate school? And, or are there things that you took with you that you're still a stickler about? Like, what do you care about when you throw off?
Yeah, I don't know. I think these, again, I find it difficult to like pull life apart and different things. And again, I come from Slovenia originally, so, and I came here for grad school. So I feel like to me, the experiences of being an immigrant and coming to grad school are somewhat inseparable by ways of, okay, I have arrived somewhere and I don't know the lay of the land. I feel like I don't know the rules. So it seemed like trying to figure out, somebody has the code somewhere. I need to find it. I need to read it. And so that nobody will think I'm weird, which already is impossible because, just not very convincing and not being weird. I think that like trying to negotiate those processes became such a central part of my being in grad school, just to finally arrive at the conclusion or developing an awareness that there is in fact no manual and nobody has that, which is not to say that we're all entering this on equal terms. Clearly we're not, but simultaneously there's still a lot of like how to find a voice, how to figure stuff out, how to like find yourself, who you are as an academic in general is what you make of it. I think was like the thing that I've arrived at after these long years of finding that stuff out. I think like a huge part of that became too that I'm arriving at this as somebody who I guess has ADHD. So a lot of these things like citation norms or whatever, oh my God, which is interesting because I am now officially a writing professor and I am addressing a lot of these things, or I need to teach them as somebody who's inherently just cognitively incapable of doing them. And I think that like that's made like a lot of the conversations, at least for me, of like what the place of AI is in this entire conversation, much chiller than I think we need to like have them, which is like the panic, our professors are no, come on guys, we just got an amazing set of tools. Let's just all try to have some sort of a conversation of like how can this, just help people that are just really terrible at formatting. Because I think that, and this is not even a question of irreverence, this is just a thing that's like legitimately difficult for me to do. I'm very good at thinking, I will always need a really good editor. I feel it's just, this is like a phrase that's come up a couple of times, and we even started with, is developing a contemplative practice, or if you're a person that's like very interested in how the mind works, I guess it's just the thing that you'll end up doing, but trying to figure out who you are, what comes naturally to you, what's instinctively difficult for you, and trying to like own those practices that like come with that, rather than trying to find where the manual is so that you can mask as best as possible. I feel like is sort of like the main takeaway out of that. And it feels like a lot of what do I stick with or what I don't care about. It aren't things that I chose. I just needed to figure out who I was to begin with. That's me.
Just really quick, I think that is so important. I think for grad school, for me, coming from the way in which I entered it, I mean, one day I was in Indiana leaving prison, and then the next day I was on a plane going to orientation at the university. So the shock of reentry with grad school was a lot. So what was critical for me was to let it be okay that I don't have some deep, close relationships with my cohort. I'm coming from another state. I'm coming from a different culture. I'm a different age group. I'm almost 50. They are not. And being okay with not having I don't know, closeness with this group, but also recognizing that you don't survive grad school without finding your tribe and being okay to go find your tribe, the people who can offer really good critique, people who help you formulate your arguments, read your stuff, read their stuff, people that you can build with, or people who challenge you as well as lift you up. I think, and that's got to be okay. That's got to be okay for you. And I just appreciate what you said about finding your processes in terms of like writing. Are you a person who, you know, does their best in the morning? Then don't, if you can avoid it, don't take classes in the morning. Don't pile your mornings with a bunch of crap. If you're best in the morning for writing, write in the morning. If you're that midnight person who needs, you know, the popcorn and the drinks and you just go all into 3 o'clock, organize your day, like experiment with that to figure out how you move and operate, and then let that be okay. It doesn't have to be like Becky Sue. Becky Sue gonna do Becky Sue. You need to do you. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Michelle, I think we should move to the last question, and thank you all so much for hanging out. I want to talk about academic rigor. So as scholars, we strive to prove the rigor of our projects to advisors and deans and job committees and fellowship application committees. But of course, rigor, etymologically, and sorry for the humanism, is associated with a lack of movement, right? You say rigor, I say mortis. Rigor. So how do you grapple with rigor as a concept and with notions that some of the most generative and exciting and impactful work in the humanities is to some not rigorous enough?
Right. This happened when I was asked to write an introduction to a criminology textbook. And the criminologist I was working with didn't like all that extra stuff that I put in there, theorizing and all these other things. The question is, I think the first question is, not rigorous enough by whose standards? And if those standards are not standards that you respect, then, or that you are trying to reach out and connect and make connective tissue with, then that's not your work. You're not here to try to convince people that your work that your work is valuable and worthy. You have to know that, like, deep within your own self, that to the point where if someone, I mean, I've actually had this in our project, in our work. I had my faculty person telling me that the research questions we were asking were already understood and known, and we had to push and say, no, go back to the archive, go, and ultimately we cracked open a case that, because we asked her to do deeper dives, and we discovered things that were not known before. So I'm just saying, you know what is required to get through your program. You know what is required by your committee. You know what's required by each faculty and each class. If you are meeting that or exceeding that standard, then you are doing rigorous work. Now, when you're creating your own projects, the goal of this is to determine what research question you're trying to ask. And if you come up with your research question and you answer it thoroughly through your entire research process, and you feel like you've made some value-added substance or production of knowledge, then that's rigorous. And I do not allow people to impose their definitions on me. I read a lot of Black feminist scholars. I'm definitely deep into self-definition. And if it's value added to me and it's value added to the community that I serve, it's rigorous. I'm sorry, if they take the information that I give them and they're able to create either systems change or individual personal change or community change, then it's rigorous. It's done. And so I don't feel like I'm a person that doesn't ascribe to that. But I had struggled with that when I first came in because I was such an outsider. And I was trying to be like, how do I show that I belong here? Yeah. Oh, let me just overdo everything so I can say I belong in this room, should have a seat at this table, I belong in this category. And I learned really quickly that I'm overworking everybody in my classes. My notes are doing circles around their notes, and I was doing too much to fit in, right? So self-definition is important. What is rigorous to you? Do you go to sleep at night thinking, this is shit? And if it's shit, it's shit. You know that for yourself. But if you feel like you've put in the work, you know what you're doing, you know what you're saying, like own it. Own it.
Yeah, well, sorry. Not to mention that like rigor is so often used just as a gatekeeping mechanism. Like the definition changes all the time, not in the good self-definitional way that Michelle is talking about, but as a way to say, I mean, how often do you hear, you almost never hear someone actually praising the rigor of someone's work. You only hear it in the negative, that someone's work is not rigorous enough. And it's almost always about work that is community engaged, that uplifts people who don't have power in the systems that, you know, are, that we're currently working within. And it's used as a way to, you know, to push out. So that's like connecting it to the previous question too. That's what I came away, not even from grad school, I think it took longer for me, but that's what I came away with no patience for, was this sense of like prestige and rigor that is based in nothing besides a desire to like hold on to some past canon that we've, you know, that we know is biased and obsolete. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a lot of patience for rigor.
Well, this has been really lovely. I've loved hearing from all of you. Such generative and generous things to say. I'd like to open the floor if anyone would like to ask any questions right now.
And I'm going to bring you a microphone if you do. I know that was a sudden shift to Q&A.
I know.
So take a deep breath. Think about it. Oh, great. Excellent.
Hi, I'm Asha. I'm a first-year PhD in sociology, so I know what it's like to be in a field where people are like, rigor, and this is the way, no art. And you're like, what? Okay. But I loved your conversation about hobbies. I'm a big hobby gal. I just started a hobby account on Instagram to document being bad at things. And it's really hard. It's really hard for me. Today I just broke my little, I've been like trying to build this little like room of things, and I just broke it by accident, so now I have to redo it. But anyway, I also have ADHD. But I wanted to ask, how do you get comfortable being bad at things, especially in like a field, you know, coming from a PhD where you're expected to be an expert, you're expected to be good at everything and fight for your place. So like, how do you practice being comfortable being bad at things and trying new things?
I mean, for me, the greatest thing is that to have a huge achievement takes very, very little. And this is going to sound weird if you're at this graduate student stage, but there sort of becomes a point, if you do this long enough and are old and middle-aged, that you know, you get an article published and you're like, all right, yeah, got an article published. And it's not like that moment where you're like, yes, my article got published, which you used to feel. And instead it's like, all right, good, I'm like closer to getting promoted or whatever, right? But instead it's like, oh, I didn't fall on my ass when I got off the horse. And that's such a tiny thing, but it is a huge achievement. And, you know, the day they let me ride the intermediate horse off who I am totally obsessed with, her name's Danny, she's very cute. I got to ride the intermediate horse and then ride her off the farm. I was like, I've arrived. And it felt probably better than like even, you know, like getting a fellowship, because it was so small and it didn't take very much to have that moment. And it's like, those are the moments where it doesn't take, you know, 20 hours of research and writing to write an article to then wait 6 months for then to maybe get a review to then wait like 2 years for it to actually be published. And then at that point, you just want to die, right? So instead it's like, oh, I just like worked at this thing for like 3 weeks and now I can do it. And it feels so good.
I have another one. I think that's really important just to survive, but it's also part of my symptom, because one of the things that I hyperfixate on is introspection. But like, develop a productive relationship with shame. Like, whenever it feels that like you've like screwed up something and like now I have to do this house again, like just try to explore what that feeling is like. Because I think there's like a lot of shame placed on shame. So we like are very uncomfortable with having negative feelings, and trying to become more comfortable with negative feelings is just such a big part of life in which we're all gonna die. Like they're like pain is inevitable, right? So like trying to like be a little more playful with that, I feel like has been such a huge thing.
I'm not comfortable with failures, and they continue to feel painful and hard, especially depending on, you know, the moment in which they happen, the context in which they happen. Like sometimes I can breeze through them and sometimes I really can't. And I've been trying to mentally, I mean, I do think that like willingness to sit with the discomfort is really important. I've been trying to reframe them for myself mentally as recognizing that those are moments where I've taken a genuine risk. Like I think there are things that I can safely succeed at, like pretty reliably at this point. And as I've been pushing those boundaries intellectually and personally and professionally, I've been failing a lot more. And I've been trying really hard to see those as moments that show that I'm working towards something new. And that's helped a little.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I'm sort of curious for those of you who are still in academia and those of you who are not, what sort of like discernment processes did you use to sort of decide what you wanted to do when you were in grad school and after grad school?
I'll take a crack at this. So the way that I came into the work that I do now at Full Spectrum Features is that I actually was intentionally part of a bridge program. Like it wasn't this like big, grand, brave leap that I did, really, you know. And it's such a good question. I'm glad that you're asking it. So I came into, I mean, the long winding road was that I got out of my PhD program, my PhD school, and then I was a postdoc at Iowa, and then I was an ACLS, an American Council of Learned Societies. They have like this bridge program. It's called the Leading Edge Fellowship. I highly recommend it. It's a good gig, where the intention there is that they purposefully fund recent humanities PhDs to work at social justice nonprofits. So it was, the path was kind of there for me. I will say that the big leap that I took though, right, in taking this very, you know, thoughtful and well-paved path is how I presented myself. When I decided to, you know, I was also doing a lot of academic, you know, job applications, and I knew that my materials needed to be different. And I'll speak a little bit about this tomorrow if any of you are joining us in the afternoon tomorrow. But, you know, I really decided that the reason why I cared about this particular fellowship, like host site at Full Spectrum Features, was because they were doing a different kind of storytelling than I had seen before. And it felt not only differently engaged with community, and that it wasn't just like this kind of partnership where like a few oral histories are pulled in there and maybe some interviews, but like the community was driving it. And it deeply resonated with me, and frankly it was also part of like my history. My ancestors were showing up, right, in the work that they were doing. And so I said that like in my cover letter. And I had never spoken about that before because it had never been legitimized, right? It was never legible, and it was always something that I wasn't, you know, supposed to kind of wear with my professional hat as well, right? And that was also the risk that got me the spot, you know. So and then you know we worked out this continuation, and now I'm, you know, director of ed there. So you know, it's a great question without a really solid, like, clear answer, other than even when there seemed like an obvious kind of pathway that I could take, like that ACLS Leading Edge Fellowship, there was still something that I had to shift, that I had to pivot
to transition outside of academia. Yeah. And I would have never done it if I hadn't applied to places outside of academia, not just as a community partner from inside, right, but into the org itself. Very, very different thing. And I have learned since then, being in this organization and being in the complex of these organizations, is that it's just a radically different space. Like the way you present, the way you argue for things, so radically different. But it's really, really hard and meaningful intellectual work, and it's hard work for me as well.
So I'm in kind of a liminal space where I'm working full-time on a grant project, but I'm also finishing my PhD. And I think that for people who care about developing student support programming for graduate students, I think increasingly we might see in the academy space where PhD students decide to go into full-time employment while also finishing their PhD. And I have to confess, working on a big multi-million-dollar grant has slowed down my progress towards my dissertation. But I'm okay with that, right? Because the work that I do has really been very meaningful to me. I would say in terms of like the discernment process, I've never had like that I don't have like an end stage where I know where I want to end up. That's discernment for me has really helped me see that one of the things that I think I excel at is being, we often refer to ourselves at Marquette like this, the team that we work on is trailblazers. Right, like I maybe sometimes I get that vision of where the trail is going to go, but I need to clear it. Now that can be really exhausting sometimes. So you have to like practice care and wellness if you're going to do that. But I'm not quite sure that I know exactly where that path is going to end up for me. As someone who likes stability, that can sometimes be very nerve-wracking, inspiring, and inside of me personally. But I also thrive in that environment too, which is, I don't know how I deal with that personal paradox, but it's just the truth of it for me. So I think instead of thinking, where's that end place for you? Because you're going to have a number of transitions even after you finish your PhD and you move into that first maybe job position after you graduate. But instead it's to think a little bit more about where are those spaces where I feel energized, where are the spaces that feel depleting, so that when you get into those experiences, if you know what that feels like, then okay, maybe this is a time when I need to pivot and make a change.
And that can include sitting on advisory boards of those of those organizations that you have interest in, joining a committee, a subject matter expert team. That could be attending conferences and having one-on-one conversations about people who are doing work that you admire. There's many ways to investigate the field while you're still receiving money to do school. And I think that helped me a great deal to zero in on what I'm currently doing. And yes, I am working while dissertating, and it is a challenge, but I also do not feel like I have to fit another mold. Like if it's 5 years, if it's 7, it's going to be 7. It's what it is, because I feel like the work that I'm doing, I found my tribe, I found my work, I found my lane. And that dissertation is going to be value add to the space I've carved out for myself. So, do some experiment. Go meet people. Ask for conversations of things based on your interests. Pick people's brains and go to those conferences where you can get those faculty members that you love. And first time I met Naomi Pickup, I fangirled her like it was Prince or something. I mean, those people whose work you super admire, go to their conferences that they attend, see them in the hallway, connect, and just ask them about that world. And they'll tell you if it's a world, they'll tell you where they are with it. I mean, some of the conversations I've had with people in academia have made me understand that that's not my ministry. That's not my role. I am not for the university. And that's fine, because I've sat down and I've talked about those processes, right? So, yeah, take advantage of that.
Oh, great. And I was going to say, after this question, we will segue to the reception part of it, where you can ask our amazing panelists questions while also having cheese and something to drink.
So I am not a graduate student anymore, and I have graduate students who work with me, and I spend a lot of time with my friends who are faculty members and fellow advisors, and some of you here know this because I'm not very good at keeping my feelings to myself, that I get very frustrated with the hierarchy that is embedded in the graduate student faculty relationship. And I have a lot of feelings about some of the way that my colleagues do the student faculty relationship. And I spend a lot of time ranting, and probably Derek is usually after class on Tuesday when Derek and I are talking, and I'm just doing some ranting. But so what are some of the ways that you negotiated that in graduate school? What are some of the tips that you have for maybe shaping the way or empowering graduate students to advocate for themselves? Because I think about this all the time, and I'm not saying I'm a saint, and maybe those of you here who work with me will agree with that, but that I do think a lot about this, and I do feel very strongly about it. So I would love to hear from, people who have thought about, advocacy and thought about the showing up in the world and empowerment. What are some of the things you can maybe tell the amazing graduate students we have here in the room?
Jump in. Was that me? I'm so sorry.
Very responsive.
Oh, that was the other one. Yeah, those relationships can be really toxic. I would say a couple of things. First, I would say to grad students, trust your intuition and trust the whisper networks that you're hearing. You do not have to work with the most shining star in your field if that is going to break you by the time you're done. It's not worth it.
That's a fact.
Yeah. I have watched so many grad students just butt heads with their advisor over and over and over again. And their work is good, but they cannot get it through because they are being stymied along the way. So if that is the situation that you are in, it is okay to change advisors. It is okay to find somewhere else where you can get that mentorship. The other thing I would say is that one relationship does not need to be everything to you, and that you can take from it what is valuable and leave aside the rest. I think that a model that I like when people are asking me on the faculty side, like what they can do to be better mentors, I think that if there can be kind of a shift from a one-to-one model to something that's more group-based, so that people are hearing more voices of authority rather than just one opinion, I think that that's really healthy. But if that's not built into the structure, which it's usually not, you can still try to craft that for yourself by fostering relationships with faculty members where and when you can. If there was someone you really connected with in a class, touch base with them from time to time, get their read on things. It's hard because everybody's really busy, but try to build that network for yourself. And it's okay if your advisor doesn't give you everything. I think about this a lot in relation to my own advisory experience when I was a grad student, which felt fairly positive at the time. I had an advisor who was very straightforward in his work with me. I was able to get through in a timely way, and all of that felt good. And it was only in retrospect, when I had disappeared from the department's website after not getting a faculty job, and all of the things that I now tell people, not like very easy steps of what not to do if you're trying to encourage people to think about where their work can have impact in the world. I realized that my advisor had really done me a disservice in a lot of ways and had not supported a lot of sides of my work that now have become the center of what I do. And that is what it is, So the advisor helped me in the stage that I was at, and that was fine. He's not someone that I look to for mentorship now. And And that's okay too. So trust your intuition, change when you need to change, and take from it what you want to take, and it's not, their word is not everything.
Can I jump in and say, so what your advisor knows about is that thing that they're the expert on. They don't know about pretty much anything else. They don't know what it's like to try and get a job right now. They don't know what it's like to try and get a job doing anything other than a professor, usually 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And they aren't always or ever the best person to be giving you advice. So my approach was to do the opposite of every single thing my committee told me. And hilariously, by the end, one day, my dissertation advisor, who, by the way, never read my dissertation, just signed off on it, she looked at my CV and she said, oh, you're going to get an academic job. And I said, what do you mean I'm going to get an academic job? You barely know me. No. She's actually, she's the kind of person, like, if you get sick, you want to be taken to your house and, like, take care of you and, like, feed you. Amazing. Read your dissertation? Not so much. And so she says, you're going to get this job. And I said, why am I going to get a job? And she said, well, look at all these things you can do. She said, you could get a job as a professor and they'll think you're really interesting because, like, they're like, oh, she's a future administrator. Or you could get a job in faculty development because you worked in that. Or you could get a job in the archives because you worked in that. And I was like, yeah, that's what I was doing when you were telling me not to do those things. That you are now telling me is why I'm going to have gainful employment a year from now. And so just keep that in mind, that you need to be seeking out and building relationships and having conversations with people who are doing things you could actually imagine yourself doing. And I was actually giving advice to a student of mine who's going to Berkeley for PhD next year and asked me about other jobs. And I said, listen, those relationships that you build, can be your next step. I know so many people whose first job out of grad school was a job in academia, in their university, doing something really, really cool. And they were able to then leverage that in a really wide array of very interesting careers.
So a lot of the work that we've been doing with HWW now, especially I think career diversity is kind of in a transitional moment where we're kind of interrogating what that term means, if it's even applicable anymore, because I think it's so much more than that. We've spent the last, at least for HWW, which was formed in 2014, the last 10 years, thinking about through the narrow lens of career development and defining broadly what that means. But at its heart, I think it's really about grad student support programming. And so often we like to say to our fellows, this burden should not be on the shoulders of graduate students. And so a lot of our work has really shifted now towards thinking about how do we help faculty, staff, and administrators build student support programming for graduate students and shifting that culture. And I can tell you the culture change in shifting the academy is hard work. I've been doing it for 6 years, and I did get punished for it, right? Like I got cut off from funding. But because I built relationships with the dean of my graduate school, and I'll tell you what, your grad school, does WashU have a centralized graduate school? Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the culture is like here. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, because at least at Marquette and a lot of the other good ones.
Yeah, sorry.
They disbanded it. Okay. Yes. But a lot of those staff and administrators who work in graduate student or graduate support, whether it might be your associate dean of grad studies or whatever that might be here, they care about what is happening with the grad student experience. I know this from the universities that I've worked with across the country. So you have to find your allies in different spaces. To Rupika's point, if you can't find that support here inside of WashU, go do some informational interviews with people in a variety of different spaces so you can start building those genuine relationships that don't feel transactional. And you can don't use the word networking. Like let's throw that out, right? It's about genuine relationship building, and there's a way in which you can develop those relationships that are sincere and that don't feel transactional. Because I would hope that none of you get into that kind of moment where I was at 6 years ago. But when those challenges do arise, you can go to those relationships and find your space where you can find additional, to at least support that you can navigate those challenges, especially if you find yourself in a toxic relationship, and do the best that you can to get out of it, because you do not deserve to be treated that way.
I guess lastly, you need to join your student union,
Yeah.
your graduate student union. Because if you have a strong one, we have a very strong one at NYU.
No.
Oh. Oh. Well, I will stop.
Well, maybe,
strong for a reason.
maybe this is a nice time to crack open a bottle of wine. However,